Hello, Trustee Burrs. I just want to say thank you again for having the patience and taking the time to speak with me with seemingly no time limits or reservations. You were respectful, you were patient, and all that was appreciated. Our chance meeting may or may not have been chance, depending on what your faith is and if you believe in divine intervention or some other reason that we were allowed to speak yesterday. I did want to share a couple insights as follow-up to the discussion that we had. Our conversation reminded me of two different conversations I've had with regards to this over the years, and I want to briefly talk about that. The first is the conversation I had with former Provost Shirley Willingons and former Assistant Personnel Provost Beth Bowen. I remember Shirley talking about being an agent to the Commonwealth, and as such, she couldn't be an activist. And this was right after I had filed a grievance, and the university denied the grievance in the spirit of, we don't create evidence against ourselves, especially if we think the party doesn't have that evidence. But that's okay. That's how the system works. But when she said that, I realized now I didn't need her to be an activist then. I didn't need her to be an activist at any point. I needed her to be an agent of the Commonwealth, but I needed her as part of that to make sure the people under her also operated as agents of the Commonwealth, and that they weren't lawless, and that they did what they were supposed to do under the procedures, policies, and laws of the university. The second conversation is the one I had within the last November with folks investigating U of L related to the evidence I have in relationship to those investigations. It amazed me how stoic they were. They reminded me of you in the way in which they engaged. At no point could I tell what they knew, what they didn't know. At no point did they feed me much information. They said a few things which were always strategic and always beneficial, but they didn't say a lot. You very much reminded me of those folks in that conversation. So I guess the one thing I want to engage is, at some point you questioned why I came to the NAACP, because they don't do legal representations, they're not lawyers, implying that that's what I need as a lawyer. They're an activist organization, and we talked about that for a while, and apparently you have some interest in supporting that and being part of that activism, which is wonderful. But I shouldn't need an activist organization. I shouldn't need a lawyer. I shouldn't need the media. The conversation with you really should be all that I need. And it's because of the question you asked that the NAACP usually doesn't support civil rights cases for just a person. They look for more societal benefits. And we talked about that as well. But let me share with you, in my vision of what greater decisions look like, a model of what I think courageous ethical leadership is, because it's clear to me that lawyers teach people today to not admit any responsibility when they're faced with public opportunities or semi-public opportunities to talk about particular issues where there may be misconduct or liability issues, to stay silent and not say a whole lot. But there is an alternative. If you did what the IRS guy did, who didn't say much during the meeting but offered to give me a ride home, and on that ride home shared things with me about how supportive he was that he didn't share in the meeting, in part because I think he understood the conflict of interest that some of those individuals had that impacted how they were going to move forward in their investigations relative to how he was interested in moving forward in his. Had you said, some of this looks really ugly and there is evidence to support some of this, I will look into this. I will talk to my board about investigating this. That would have been a wonderful first step to make me feel like I didn't need to do anything else myself. Secondly, if this gets resolved without the hiring of an attorney on my part, it saves the Commonwealth millions, and given, or at least a lot of money, and given that there's been so much money wasted in fraud and embezzlement and bribery and conspiracy in all likelihood, that would be a wonderful thing as well. Finally, the idea that if I was wrongfully terminated and there's evidence that circumstantially and directly leads to that conclusion, then you're still my board member. The lawyers at the university are still my lawyers because I'm still technically an employee. You just have to make the decision as courageous ethical leadership that that's the case, and not wait for a court to do it, not wait for media pressure to do it, not wait for me to have to try to desperately do something to get someone on board with the idea that the truth is the truth. I did just a little bit of background work on you after I left. Without question, you are a courageous ethical leader. And I look forward to you processing the information and perhaps thinking about the information in ways that might challenge convention and might find a greater decision out there that could be a winning proposition for everyone without necessarily having to create the ugly adversarial, hide all your cards, keep everything in quiet places, and engage in more and more cover-up and misconduct until we can move forward. Because the one thing that's true is whether or not you've ever received any of my emails, the heated disagreement I had with your colleague, Trustee Black, the emails that were sent to Provost Bowen regarding that performance she put on about African American retention that day at the trustees meeting, or any of the other things I've written that have been some very positive and favorable, offering concessions if a deal could be made. If you haven't read any of those, you now know the story. And what you choose to do ultimately may impact whether or not you become part of a conspiracy or you end a conspiracy. Sadly, I think everybody that read that article that is in a position of power had a duty to act. And arguably everybody that hasn't acted is concerned that they might be guilty of obstructing justice or being negligent. Not toward me, because on face, the crimes committed by James Ramsey and Kathleen Smith on September 29th, 2011 don't have anything to do with me. They defrauded a deferred compensation fund for $53,000 in an embezzlement scheme that probably has circumstantial evidence and probable cause for other crimes on top of that that would need to be investigated. But the fact that you are in administration and you now know that, and you've seen the article and you've seen the evidence through the open records request and the writings of Christopher Ott, who also hasn't pushed harder on this, maybe because there's some liability issues because he waited so long to either understand or act on the issues in his own piece. That would be a shame. Because that seems to be where we're at today, that a lot of people are unwilling to act or afraid to act, probably out of fear of liability reasons, partly out of optics fears of coming to save a man like me, as I'm perceived on the Google, in the criminal record. But most that know me, and most that continue to benefit from the assets I created as a professor, once as a funeral director, and as a black man, they know a different story. You know that story a little bit better now because we talked for 30, 40 minutes. So when I see you sitting in the NAACP office, and I come to you, and I speak respectfully to you, and I speak with both compassion and empathy, but I bring you information and persuasive argument that cannot be denied, it is my hope and my prayer that you respond in kind with the appropriate, ethical, courageous leadership that this moment requires. Thank you again for speaking. I hope we have an opportunity to speak again. I will continue to move forward as if there's no reason to believe you will take any actions regarding that conversation, because that's what I have to do. Absent engagement, I must assume there's disinterest or unwillingness to move or act. Thank you again. Have a wonderful, wonderful day and a great weekend.